Welcome everyone to this Cochrane training webinar. I'm Julie Glanville. I'm a co-convener of the Cochrane Information Retrieval Methods Group, and it's my great pleasure today to be chairing this session. And we're really lucky today to have with us Melissa Rethlefsen, excuse me, Melissa. And Melissa is going to be talking to us about PRISMA-S. Melissa is Executive Director of the Health Sciences Library and Informatics Center at the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center at Albuquerque, New Mexico in the USA. Melissa was previously the Associate Dean at the George A. Smathers Libraries and Faculty Director of the Health Science Center Libraries at the University of Florida. Melissa is the first author of the new PRISMA-S publications, and her research interests are in the reproducibility of systematic review search strategies, and with special emphasis on library and information specialist contribution.
All right, well, thank you so much for that introduction. And are my slides being shared right now?
Yes, they are.
Yes, okay, perfect. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you about PRISMA-S, and I want to give a special thanks to Julie for inviting me to this, but also a special thanks to all of you who are attending. It's bright and early for me. It's 8 a.m. my time, but I know, I hope that people are coming from all over the world and hope that you're having a good day wherever you are. So PRISMA-S, just going to go ahead and get to my slides here. Today we're going to talk about a couple of different things, and Julie already went through the agenda a little bit. So we're going to talk about what PRISMA-S is, why we developed it, how to use it, and then we're going to talk about the differences between PRISMA 2009 and PRISMA-S, and then have time for questions. So jumping right in, an introduction to PRISMA-S. I think the first question that we've often gotten is, why did we develop PRISMA-S? And really, PRISMA-S was developed based out of research that one of my co-authors, Jonathan Kofel, and I did, where we were looking at reproducibility of search strategies. And we found a very low percentage of published papers that actually had reproducible search strategies if you looked at all of the different components of reproducibility. And not only that, though, we found that there really wasn't a good standard for what constituted a reproducible search. Different people who had done research in this area had measured different things, and we just found that there was overall a lack of consensus. We really wanted to help build this consensus by creating a tool that librarians, information specialists, and systematic reviewers could use to transparently report their searches and make sure that they were including all of those important components. We also really wanted to tie it to the PRISMA guideline. As you know, PRISMA is one of the most widely used reporting guidelines. It has a lot of name recognition, and it's been a really important contributor to the transparency of systematic reviews overall. And so we wanted to be affiliated with that. So to go about developing PRISMA-S, very briefly, we first started by getting permission from the PRISMA team to see whether or not it would be appropriate to develop an extension. Then we put together our team, and then we used a guideline on creating reporting guidelines to develop our process. We went through and we did a literature search across all sorts of different kinds of documents to pull out as many items as possible that were relevant to reporting literature searches. And then we took those items and a list of experts that we had developed, again, globally, and we invited them to participate in a 3-stage Delphi survey looking at those items. After that was done, the items that survived the Delphi survey process got to go into a consensus conference. And then from that consensus conference, we developed the initial draft of a checklist and explanation and elaboration. We opened this up for comment publicly, but as well as specifically inviting all of the consensus conference participants and the Delphi survey participants. And then we took some time to finalize what the actual checklist and E&E would become. Explanation and elaboration. We moved it on to publication, and now we're in the sharing phase. So we're disseminating information about PRISMA-S to all of you. So what is PRISMA-S? It's essentially like any other reporting guideline. It has two main components. It has a checklist, in this case with 16 items, and it has an explanation and elaboration. And the explanation and elaboration component gives examples of good reporting. So what does it look like to clearly report a literature search? An explanation of why it's important to report it, and then also suggestions for where and how to report that item. So that's just a little intro to it, but now how do you actually use PRISMA-S? The first question, I think, is where can I find PRISMA-S? And it has been published already in systematic reviews. It was published there in January. It is also due to be published in Journal of the Medical Library Association, but it's unfortunately delayed in publication. But I think the easiest way to find it is actually to go to the PRISMA-S page on the Equator Network. We were very lucky to have one of the members of the Equator Network on the PRISMA-S team. And I think that it's no coincidence that we have such wonderful reporting there, having a librarian work there. So on the Equator Network page, you can find links to the checklist documents themselves. You can find it in PDF, Word, and Excel formats. You can find links to the published paper. You can find links to related PRISMA documents, so PRISMA 2020 and all of the other PRISMA extensions that might be useful. You can find links to our protocol, and you can find links to the entire data set. So it's one kind of convenient place to find everything. This is what the PRISMA checklist looks like, and I of course don't expect you to be able to read it on the screen. It's very, very small, but just to give you an idea of what is on here. The PRISMA-S checklist is broken up into 4 different areas, so information sources and methods, search strategies, peer review, and managing records. And one thing to say is that PRISMA-S, the checklist, we know that not every single literature review, not every single systematic review is going to use all of the things in the information sources and not all of the things that are in the search strategies. So it's really to guide you if you're going to be using some of these different kinds of resources. But it also should be considered minimal guidance. So we know that for example, some people will want to report additional items. Maybe they'll want to give a narrative description of the justification of all of their search terms. Maybe they'll want to say who developed the search and so on. Those things aren't in PRISMA-S, but that does not mean that you can't include them or that they're not valuable. It's just that they just didn't make it into the checklist. So please feel free to add additional documentation beyond what's in PRISMA-S. This is an example of what one of the items looks like in the explanation and elaboration component. And this is the shortest one. It's the only one that could reasonably fit on the screen, but I just wanted to walk you through it very briefly. So the top component where it says item 2, multi-database searching, that's just sort of like a short term to describe the database, tells you which item number it is. And then right below it is the actual checklist item. So if databases were searched simultaneously on a single platform, state the name of the platform listing all of the databases searched. Right below that are 2 examples from the literature of where someone has run searches simultaneously on a single platform and reported both of those databases. In some of the different items, you might have 1 example, some you might have as many as 4 different examples, but we tried to give some really good representative examples from the literature. Below that is the explanation component, and this is what really tells you why that this particular item is important. Any information that you might need about reporting it, giving more details, and so on. And below that is the suggested location for reporting. So when you're talking about reporting searches, you know, there might be multiple different places where you can discuss it. You could put it in the abstract, you could put it in the methods section, you could put it in the supplementary materials, you could put it in all 3. And so we try to give some guidance in that suggested location for reporting component. There are 2 other features that are in the published full document, and one is a glossary. And this is really just to give everyone who's reading PRISMA-S the same frame of reference as to what we mean by each of these terms. And especially because sometimes terms might be descriptive of more than one type of item, or you might have multiple terms that could describe something. So this at least gives you the frame of reference that we were working under, and hopefully gives you some additional information there. So this is just an example of the entry for the term database. It tells you that we are specifically using the term database to describe literature databases designed to search journal literature, which is of course different than the more general broad version of database. The other part that we have that's another little addition to PRISMA-S is a section on developing supplementary materials. And supplementary materials essentially are very important to reporting literature searches accurately, because of course you can't report all of the details of searches within an actual manuscript. But we've found that you really can't rely on the journals themselves to be able to maintain the links to their supplementary materials in perpetuity. And so we strongly recommend that instead of relying on journals to publish your literature searches and documentation, that you actually use a repository of some sort to be able to make sure that you have control over that documentation. So if you're just getting started on a project, we would recommend reading the whole explanation and elaboration, because it might give you a sense of how you could actually plan out your documentation and figure out from the beginning what you might want to do to record different components of your process. When you're actually getting to the part where you're documenting and reporting your search itself, then you would want to go through the PRISMA-S checklist and figure out which items would apply. And then for each of those items that would apply to your particular project, then you would want to refer to that explanation and elaboration document so that you could learn what you're supposed to report, how you're supposed to report it, why, if you're curious about that, and then where might be a great place to report it. And once you're more familiar with using PRISMA-S, then you would rely more on the checklist and only refer to that explanation and elaboration document for unfamiliar or lesser used items. So now I'm going to pause for a question if there are any, and then we will continue on.
Lovely, Melissa. I've got some questions for you. You'll be pleased to know. I'm just moving the questions around. First of all, there's just a clarification from Jida Iskandarani asking, is it different to PRISMA 2020 that was recently published? I will put this in the chat.
Well, thanks for that question. And I'm going to talk about that briefly in just a moment, but just to give you a flavor, PRISMA 2020 and PRISMA-S, some of the authors overlapped. So we tried to make that guidance as clear as possible, that we were trying to have them be similar and not overwrite one another or say different kinds of meanings or directions. And in fact, PRISMA 2020 refers people to PRISMA-S for more details on the search-related components. So we're not in competition, we are an extension to PRISMA.
That's great, Melissa. I've got another question here. This is from Margaret Vugren. She is asking, what are examples of registries?
So there's quite a few examples of registries, and so that could include OSF, which is a general registry, clinicaltrials.gov, ICTRP, which is the WHO's. There's lots of different kinds of registries all over, and so we tried to make it as generic as possible, and then in the explanation and elaboration document give guidance about what some of those might be and then how they've been well reported.
Thank you. Another question from Margaret. Is there an updated version, I think she means for PRISMA-S, for scoping reviews?
We designed PRISMA-S specifically to be flexible to include all different types of literature search reporting. So it is designed to go with PRISMA, but We also anticipate that it could go with any of the PRISMA extensions, including PRISMA for scoping reviews, that it could go with the Joanna Briggs guidance, that it could be used with ROSES, which is an environmental sciences one, that it could be used with any kind of literature reporting at all. So it's not designed just for systematic reviews, it's really designed to be broad.
Thank you. And a sort of a basic definitional question next, I think. The question is from Hilary Krause. She's saying, does database in PRISMA-S include something like Google Scholar?
That's a great question, and yes, Google Scholar would be included as a database because it is one that's searching journal literature. It's, of course, it seems like it's only semi-structured data, so it could also be counted as a web resource, and we'll get into those a little bit in a moment. But there are lots of different ways that it's something a source like Google Scholar could technically be described, but we did lump it in with the databases and or web resources, depending on how you use it.
Thank you. I think one final question, Melissa. There are many more here, but I think one final one to then let you carry on. This is a question from Stefano Giuseppe asking, can you give some examples of repositories for storing supplementary materials?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. We do give a few examples in the guidance itself. And so I'm probably just going to be repeating what's in there. But one is Zenodo, which is really great because it gives you a DOI. Another is Figshare, also can give you a DOI. There's lots of different examples out there, and many institutions also have institutional repositories that they've committed to preserve in perpetuity. And so that's a really good option as well. And in fact, the example that we use in PRISMA-S talking about that is an example where someone has placed all of their supplementary materials into an institutional repository. In this particular case, it was at the University of Michigan, but there's lots of different options that are out there.